Welcome to the tutorial to create a customized AzureWebFarm.OctopusDeploy web farm. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use Visual Studio and NuGet to create a web farm using Windows Azure web roles and deployed to from OctopusDeploy in literally minutes. The first step is to, in Visual Studio, create a new cloud project. It's important to make sure that you're using .NET Framework 4.5. You can name the cloud project whatever you want. In this case, I'm going to call it webfarm.cloud. It's also important to make sure that you've got the version 2.2 of the Windows Azure tools installed on your computer and that you select it when creating the cloud project. For the moment, don't bother adding a web role or a worker role. Just click OK. Now, when you create the web role, you don't actually need anything in it unless you want something in the main application. And generally, you're not going to want to bother for that. So what we can do is we can add a new project from the web, and we can just add an ASP.NET empty web application. Again, you can call this whatever you want. In this case, I'm going to call it web farm. It's also important to make sure that it's still got .NET Framework 4.5 selected. Now, we need to associate that new web project as a web role with the cloud project. To do this, you just click on roles with the right-click button. You add a web role project in the solution, you select the project and you click OK. Before we get started any further, there's a few things that you will want to configure that you would generally configure for any web role project that you would do. The first is RDP. To do that, you can right-click on the cloud project and go to Package, and then tick the box that says Enable Remote Desktop for all roles. It will automatically bring up this dialog here. Now, in your drop-down, if you don't have a certificate, then you can create one. In my case, I've got a bunch of certificates, but in this case, I'm going to select this one here. Note that the certificate thumbprint here, in this case 5BFCF, needs to be the same as a certificate that you've uploaded to a cloud service that you've previously created in the Windows Azure portal. In my case, I've already got a cloud service here called Rob D. Moore Web Farm. And you'll see here, I've got a certificate here with that same thumbprint that I've created and uploaded into the certificates section of the cloud service. You just need to put any username and password that you want. You should note them down because there's no way to get them back. If you do forget them though, you can easily reset them in the portal once you've uploaded your web role solution. As you can see, there's complex security rules that you have to meet. Note that the expiry date will generally be a year from the day that you are creating this. Now, if you want your web farm to be up and running for a number of years, then you might want to change that. Or alternatively, you can let it expire, and as I said, you can change it again in the portal when it's been deployed. Once you've done that, you can either click on Package just to check that the package can be created, or you can click Cancel. It doesn't really matter which. Cool, and we can see here that the package was successfully created. Now, there's a couple of other things that it's worth configuring before we continue. Firstly, it's important to make sure that if you want to emulate the web farm locally, that your local configuration has an instance count of 1. If there's more than one instance locally, when you run it, it's going to try to install Octopus tentacles multiple times on your computer, and that's really not going to work. The other thing to look at is that the cloud package has at least 2 instances so that you meet Windows Azure's 99.95% SLA. The other thing that's really important is that you put in a real a real storage connection string for the diagnostics connection string. If you don't, then when you deploy your package, Windows Azure will reject it. Here's one I prepared earlier. The other thing to think about is looking at your CS definition file and thinking about what VM size that you want. The pricing page on the Windows Azure website, more specifically the pricing page for cloud services, shows you all of the different instance sizes that you can use. I would only use an extra small in a development environment because you have a shared CPU, and sometimes they can perform a little bit poorly. But it's generally pretty good for development and test scenarios, unless you have an application that uses a reasonable amount of memory or CPU. Smalls perform really, really well, but they do only have 1 core. So if your site's under any reasonable amount of load, then I would generally choose a medium, which is the first one that has 2 cores. And these perform really, really well. Generally, I wouldn't choose more than a medium for a web role site. At that point, unless of course you have an application that has very high memory use or an extreme amount of multi-threading. But generally you would want to offload that kind of processing to dedicated worker roles. At the point where you want to get more scale, you generally want to scale horizontally rather than vertically. Now, in this case, we're going to keep with small, and we're not going to change it. So at this point, you've got a web role project that is basically ready to go. We can deploy this right now. You can do it inside of Visual Studio by right-clicking and going Publish, or you can right-click and go Package as we did before, generate the package, and then use that to either manually upload it into the Windows Azure portal, or to build that on a CI server and use a PowerShell script or similar to automate the deployment of your web farm. Generally, I would recommend the later, but it's worth noting that these web farms you're going to basically deploy once and pretty much leave it until such a time that you want to upgrade it for some reason. I would highly recommend that you do deploy at this point to Azure to make sure that everything's working, you've configured everything correctly before continuing. Deploying web roles can be a bit of a pain because it's hard to get them right at first. There's all these little things that can go wrong, like not having the correct diagnostics connection string, for instance. That, you know, if you don't quite get them right, then it's a little bit of a pain because it does take, you know, around 10 minutes to deploy these things. In this case, I'm going to trust that it's actually going to work and move on to the next step. So at this point, we've basically got a project. It's a bare bones project. It's ready to be upgraded to be a web farm. So all you need to do is make sure that the default project is set onto the web project that you created, and then simply go install package AzureWebFarm.OctopusDeploy, and make sure that you're pointing to NuGet.org. Now, a whole bunch of things just happened. Apart from the fact that there was probably 5 or 6 dependencies that got installed, there's an initialization PowerShell script that we've included in AzureWebFarm.OctopusDeploy that performs a number of configurations to your project. One of the things it also did is it actually changed the CC proj file behind the cloud project, which is why I've got this dialog here. Make sure you click reload for this dialog, otherwise you'll need to restart Visual Studio before you can deploy your solution. If you're interested to know what it did, you can look for more details on our README, or you can scroll up and have a little look because we kind of explain in the console here what's going on. But basically at this point, all you need to do is, if you want to test this locally to make sure that this is going to work against your Octopus deploy server, which I highly recommend that you do first, then you simply go into the local configuration file and change these 4 variables here that have been added. The URL to your Octopus server, your API key for a user that has permission to create machines, delete machines, create releases, and run deployments, the name of the environment that you want to deploy into, and also the name of a role that you want to give your tentacle. Then simply make sure that the cloud project is your startup project, hit F5, and everything should just work. Your machine should register itself on the Octopus deploy server in the environment that you've selected, and any deployments to that environment that have been defined should automatically be deployed to your local IIS. Now in this case, I'm not going to bother doing that. I'm going to change the cloud configuration. Again, here's one I prepared earlier. I'm going to explain these in a little bit while we wait for this to deploy, but firstly I want to actually publish this now that it's ready. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go publish. In this case, I've already loaded my subscription. It's figured out that there's a cloud service that I can deploy to, which is the one that I showed you earlier. I'm going to deploy it to the production slot using the release configuration and the cloud configuration here, which we just added those 4 variables to. And I'm going to click publish. Now this is going to take somewhere between 8 and 15 minutes to deploy. And it should come up here and you can see what the status is inside of Visual Studio as it progresses. Now in the meantime, I'm going to explain what I've got here. Basically, I've set up an Octopus deploy server. It's actually deployed in an Azure virtual machine. You don't have to do that. But one thing you will gain from that is that your deployments to your web roles will be extremely fast if it's in the same region. It'll probably be fast anyway, but I've noticed deployment times of around 15 seconds in the testing that I've been doing. It's important to note that you need at least version 2.0.8 of Octopus Deploy for all of this to work. And in this case, I've basically defined 2 environments. In this case, we're using the production environment, which I configured here in tentacle environment. The role is going to register itself with a web server role. And I've got one demo project defined in here. The process for that project basically deploys a single NuGet package to the web server role. And importantly, it also configures IIS. I've named the website demo. I've got an app pool here that's .NET 4 with the application pool identity, and it's created a binding, in this case just for HTTP, to the website test.robdmore.id.au. So this will mean that even though the web role has no idea about this website, as soon as Octopus Deploy deploys to it, it will create this in IIS for me, as well as deploying the files contained in the NuGet package for that site when it gets deployed. Now, we can keep an eye on what's going on with this deployment by clicking on the Instances tab inside of my cloud service. And you can see at the moment the 2 VMs are being created. You can also keep track of it inside of Visual Studio, and this should mirror the status that's being shown inside of the portal. Now we basically just need to play a waiting game. So the VMs have now been provisioned and created, and they're being started up. Now that they've started, they're going to run all of the code that we've created in AzureWebFarm.OctopusDeploy. There are a series of steps that will happen. Firstly, the role's going to download the latest version of the Octopus Deploy Tentacle installer. It's going to run that installer under elevated privileges. It's then going to run a series of commands against the Tentacle executable that has been installed on the server. These commands basically configure it to use file system storage that Azure has provisioned for that role. And then it will basically register itself with the server that has been configured using the API key that's been given, and put itself in the environment that you provided and the role that you provided. At that point, the servers should start showing up in the Environments tab. And as you can see, they've actually already appeared there. What's then going to happen is they're going to start requesting deployments to them of the latest version of any applications in the environment in which they've been provisioned, in this case production. So those servers have seen that in the production environment there's an application called demo. The latest version is 1.0.0.0, and both of them just requested deployments of that application. You can see here 738, 738, both of them have happened. And if you look in the task log, you'll see that both of them were deployed to a specific machine ID, which is the ID of that particular machine. If we switch back here, then we'll see that both of them are going to be set to a running state. Then all you need to do is point your domain name at the DNS name of your cloud service. So in this case, robdmorewebfarm.cloudapp.net. You can do this with a CNAME entry in your DNS server, or alternatively, for testing purposes, you can just change your local host file entry. Once you've done that, you simply go to the website. So in this case, the domain name that I configured inside of Octopus Deploy was test.robdmor.id.au. And as you can see, the website is fully functioning. So the end result of all of this is you've now got a solution in Visual Studio that contains the cloud services definition for a web farm that can be deployed to by Octopus Deploy. Because you've got this solution in Visual Studio, you can configure it and customize it however you want. So you can go in and change the service configuration. You can change your service definition. You can add, different endpoints. I can add a HTTPS endpoint, for instance, or maybe some obscure TCP port. You can add other arbitrary startup scripts if there's other things you want to install on your servers. You can change the role entry point code to add other arbitrary code that you can run on the start, on stop, and while the server is running. And you can also add any other files that you want to the default website for your cloud services application. So this tutorial has demonstrated how to set up a customized AzureWebFarm.OctopusDeploy enabled web farm.